I'm going to show you how to switch on the new cost accounting features. I'm going to show you then how to set up cost centres and distribution rules. I'm going to show you how the system will use these cost centres and distribution rules, and then we'll look at the standard reports that SAP provides for use with cost centres. And then finally at the end we'll have a short time hopefully for questions. Okay, firstly then, you can use the new cost accounting facility. You need to switch it on in administration. So if we go to administration, system initialization and general settings, and we select the cost accounting tab, which is new, you'll see that we now have a new tick box, which I have already ticked on, which says that I want to use multi-dimensions. Okay, so whereas in the previous versions of SAP we just had the ability to define a single cost centre in any of the transactions, we now have the ability to set up multiple dimensions, each with their own set of cost centres. To display the information in the screens, we then have the option to choose from either showing them in a unified column where we separate them by a semicolon, or in separate columns, and I've opted for the separate columns today. In addition, we now have the ability to get the system to warn us about whether or not a particular distribution rule or project code has been entered. So we can actually say that we want to make a particular code blocked, to block the posting if we haven't entered it, or whether we don't want to put any warnings in. Okay. Similarly with the distribution rules, we can see I have two dimensions here, and in both cases I've said I want to block posting if it hasn't been entered. Okay. So again, we have the option of without warning or block posting. Okay, so once I've switched on the multi-dimension cost accounting feature, I then set up the master data for my cost accounting. So if we go down to financials and cost accounting and dimensions. Okay, so here you can see we can now specify up to 5 different dimensions. Okay, so and we can give them a particular name, which will be used in the different screens and drop-downs and reports. And so you can see in my case I've chosen to use 2 dimensions, one which is going to relate to region and one which is going to relate to product group. Okay, so purely user definable, and you can see once I've got postings against my dimensions, then these are also greyed out because I can't deselect the dimension once I've started using it. Okay, so next I go down to my cost centres screen. So this is very similar for those of you who've used cost centres previously. You'll recognise this. What we have extra is the ability to define the dimension that the cost centre relates to. So a cost centre can only belong to one dimension. You'll also notice that we now have effective from and to dates and also an active flag. Okay, so this allows us much more control and flexibility over the use of our cost centres. And any cost centres that are marked as inactive or where the posting date is outside of the effective date, then that particular cost centre won't appear in the selection list. Okay, so if I just find here and show what cost centres I've created. Okay, so in the case of my region, let's just select this first one here. So, okay, I've split my region into Europe, rest of world, and UK and Ireland. So you can see here that the region is linked to the cost centre. And then you'll also see that for product group I've defined 3 different cost centres: other products, IBM products and HP products. and they're all active and effective from yesterday. Okay. If I open the table by clicking on this button, I can see the different cost centres by dimension. So for product group, there's my HP, IBM and other, and for the region, there's my Europe, rest of world and UK and Ireland. Okay, so we'll look at the distribution rules next. So a distribution rule gives us the ability to link together a number of cost centres so that we can allocate costs that aren't specific to one of the individual cost centres across multiple cost centres on an automated basis. Okay, by default, each cost centre is also set up as a distribution rule, which you may have seen in that last table that we looked at. So in this example, I have set up okay, so there's my distribution rule for Europe. Okay, so the one that I've set up to have an allocation is I've set up a product line distribution, and I've said that for HP cost centre I want to allocate 20% of the value. For IBM I want to allocate 70% of the value, and for other products I want to allocate 10% of the product of the value. Now, without me clicking on the direct allocation button here, if I use a distribution rule, say for recording the cost of an overhead expense, normally the system will put that into what's called the indirect column, or the indirect allocation column. It hasn't come directly from the individual cost centre, but it's come through from the distribution rule itself. I do have the option of saying that I want a particular distribution rule row to appear under the direct allocation column if I wish. Okay. In addition, just as we saw with the cost centre codes, I can also set effective from and to dates, and also an active flag. And again, if I set them as inactive or the date falls without the range, then again they won't appear in the list for selection. Okay, I can further make selections for in my chart of accounts. So I can link particular distribution rule or project code for use in the system. So if I go down to operating costs and electricity, what I want to do here is I want to use my product group distribution rule to indirectly allocate the cost of my electricity when I receive the bill for that. So by clicking on product group and tabbing, I can select my product line distribution, and I can update that here. So we'll see later how we actually use that then within the system. I can also choose, do you remember back at the beginning we were able to say that we wanted to block postings for a particular code if a particular dimension hadn't been entered. So if I say select my sales revenue code, and you can see here that I've ticked the region dimension for my distribution rule. And what that means is that I'm not saying a specific cost centre or distribution rule applies to that particular revenue code, but what I am saying is that because I've ticked the box here and said that it's relevant for cost accounting, in conjunction with the block posting that I've set up at the beginning, then when I try to post an accounting transaction and I haven't entered a valid regional cost centre, then the system will bring up an error message. And again, we'll see an example of that later. Okay, so we saw earlier the table of cost centres and distribution codes. So we'll just go back and review that again. So again, I can look at it by dimension, either product group or region. So there's my 3 individual cost centres, and finally my distribution rule. From here I can drill down into my distribution rule or drill down into my cost centre. I can see the effective from and to dates on these, and any cost centres and distribution rules that are current and active will be shown with their values in bold here. Okay, so if I had any inactive ones or ones that fell outside of the effective from and to dates, then they would show up but they wouldn't be bold. Okay, so you can see that my individual cost centres are always classed as 100%, and my distribution role, here's my split of 20 for HP, 70 for IBM and 10 for other. Just one other thing to point out, and that is in terms of the terminology that's used throughout the system. In the past we had a bit of a mixture. In different screens you might see profit centre, you might see distribution rule. Throughout the system now in 881, in all cases, anywhere where previously it referred to profit centre, it will now refer to cost centre. And in all documents, again we'll see later, it will refer to distribution rule. Okay, so we can finally be consistent and talk about cost centres and distribution rules without wondering what the difference is if people have seen the term profit centre somewhere. So again, it's all been standardised now in this release. Final part of setup I'm going to show you is the ability to define what's called a cost centre hierarchy. Now if we go into the cost centre hierarchy screen, again for those of you who've maybe set up the territories in SAP Business One, you might see that this looks similar to that, in that you can create a hierarchy and add either same level or tiled values to it. So in this case, in this example, I've set up a product group dimension, and if I go into here and select product line, you can see that I've set up a little grouping that I'm going to use in reporting later. So I've given it a title of product line, and then I've split it into 2 sections, which is called printers, and underneath that I've listed my different types of printers. Then I've done a second section which is other, and again just a section of other to keep the levels similar. And then finally I've got a total. Now you notice when I click on the line for total, I can indicate whether something is a text title or a subtotal. So in this case it's a subtotal. And by clicking on the formula button, I can see that the total that I'm going to display there is the sum of everything under printers plus everything under other. Okay, so product line is just a title, printers and other are neither text title or subtitle, they just give me my groupings, and then finally total is my subtotal of the 2 sections. Now to add the individual cost centres in to the different sections of my hierarchy, if I highlight this line here and right click and click on hierarchy item details, I can see that I've included the cost centre IBM for that one. For this one I've included the HP cost centre, and under other I haven't yet included one. So if I click into here, into my cost centre code, I can bring up a list of all the as yet unassigned cost centres, and obviously in this example we're doing here today I just have the one, so I want other to be in there and press update. Okay, so I can build up different views of my data and then bring those in a little like with the financial report templates that you may have used which allows you to present the information in a slightly different way from the standard levels and groupings. Okay, so that's the setup of the different cost centre and distribution rules. So now we're going to do some transactions and see how the system actually makes use of those. And then following this, we'll look at the standard reports that are available. Okay, so I'm going to go now into sales, AR, and delivery, and okay, so firstly I'm going to just duplicate this. No, I'm going to duplicate it. I'm just going to do delivery. Okay, so if I select my customer, and firstly I'm going to pick a UK customer, parameter technology, and then I'm going to select a number of items. So I'm going to pick an IBM product. Okay, and I've used the form settings to make sure that my region and product group cost centre fields are visible and active so that I can enter the details. So under region, I'm going to select UK and Ireland, and under product group I'm going to select IBM. Okay, so you can see here that the system also duplicates the region and product group that I've selected into the cost of goods sold region and product group, and also, just for your information, I've selected to display the GL account and the cost of goods sold account in here as well, so you can see the ones that are being selected. So I'll repeat the same, this time for HP product. And, okay, so UK and Ireland and HP. And then finally, a different product from the other group. Okay, so UK and Ireland and other. Okay, so you can see the information that's in here. Now, obviously I've manually selected these values here today, but what you can do is use, for example, a formatted search to select the region and the product group based on whatever rules you've set up. And obviously, depending on how you've defined your different dimensions would obviously determine how you went about selecting the particular values. But a formatted search is a straightforward way of doing it if you can easily select, say, either a value that's related to the customer or to do with the product. Okay, because you can set up a value on the item master or say the business partner master, and then use the formatted search to automatically pull those values in. Okay, so if I add my delivery, okay, right, so now I'm just going to do the same for a US customer, so I'll pick SG Electronics, and I'll pick the same items, so an IBM product, an HP product, and another product. Okay, so this time I want rest of world and IBM, rest of world, IBM, sorry, HP, and finally rest of world and other. Okay, so I add that. Okay, and finally, to complete the grouping, I'll select this German customer for my European. So again, select my items, region, Here you are, IBM. Select my HP item. Here you are, and HP. And finally, I'll select my other product, so region and other. Okay, so I add the delivery. Okay, right, so next I'm going to, so that'll have done my cost of goods sold postings, and if we drill back and look at the one of the accounting transactions, you can see here they've all been posted to the same nominal code, the raw materials cost of goods sold, but if I highlight the individual rows, you can see here that my distribution rule field contains the fact that it was for Europe and an IBM product, for this line Europe and HP, and this line Europe and other. Okay, so that's how the system does the postings, and it's obviously this information that's then used for the reporting later. So if I now take that and copy it to an invoice and add that, okay, and similarly I'll go back and add this one to an invoice. Now, the other thing that I'll just show you in a moment when I get back to my first delivery is, remember we had this account was flagged as requiring the region to be entered. So when I copy this to my AR invoice, I'm going to just blank out the region for a moment, and then I'm going to press add. Now at this point at the bottom, hopefully you can all see the red line error message at the bottom of my screen. It tells me that that account, GL account 400,000, needs a distribution rule assignment for dimension 1. Okay, so that's my dimension 1, which is region, and it's blocking the posting because I said I wanted to block posting at the beginning. So it won't let me do the posting without entering the particular cost centre. Now, I think you'll agree that's a major step forward, because for those of you who have been using cost centres in the past, unless you've had some additional software either installed or written to make it a mandatory field, then it's been a case of people having to remember that they have to enter that information. So this makes the discipline much greater, the fact that you can actually set that to be a mandatory field now. Okay, right, so now I've put that back in, I'll press add. Okay, and we just go back to the invoice and drill through to the accounting transaction. Again, you can see here, if I go down to the revenue line, you can see my UK and Ireland, IBM, UK and Ireland, HP, and UK and Ireland, other. Okay, so again, although they've all been posted to the same revenue code, so that the system can do the cost centre reporting, which we'll see shortly, it's actually split the posting down by the distribution rule combinations. Okay. Okay, and finally, just so that I can show you how the system uses the individual distribution rule linked to a particular GL code, we'll just go into purchasing and, pick a purchase invoice and pick my supplier. This is my electricity bill. I'll put today's date in here. So electricity, Q1 2011. Pick the GL account, and it was 6, 1, all zeros. Okay, So now you can see immediately that without me having to enter anything, the system has selected that product group. So again, if you remember back to when we set it up in the beginning, there's my electricity code, there's my tick against product group, and there's my default distribution rule. So by default, the system will pull that value in. Obviously, I have the ability to overwrite it if I want to, but in this case, I'm going to keep it in there. And so that will now be allocated across my different cost centres in the percentages that I've specified. Okay, so again, if I add that, okay, so what we've seen so far then is how to actually set up the cost centre in the system. Then we've done several transactions on the sales side and also one on the purchasing side, and now we'll see how the system will report on that cost centre information that we've set up. Okay, so to look at the individual reports, again we need to go back to financials, the cost accounting section, and the main reports we're going to look at today are the cost centre and distribution reports, and the cost accounting summary report, and the budget versus cost accounting report. Okay, so there are two of these reports that are based around the dimension but that don't make use of that hierarchy that we set up earlier, and then we'll look at two reports that do make use of that hierarchy. Okay, so firstly, if I select the distribution report, if I select, so it comes up and it defaults into the first dimension that we have set up, so I'm going to change this to say I want to look at the product group. Okay, and I can put in a range of dates. I can also limit it down to a range of distribution rules as well if I want to. So again, if I drop down the list, I'd see all of the cost centres and distribution rules that are linked into that particular dimension. Okay, but I'm just going to do it for everything today. So I can also choose to hide any cost centres that have no value. So if I run this now, you can see, let's just expand this down. Firstly, if we start off with the collapsed view, I can see a summary of the individual distribution rules. So I've got the breakdown of my HP products, my IBM products, my other products, and then my product line distribution, if you remember my electricity bill that I chose to distribute. Okay, so I can either expand the whole report with the expand button, or I can just click on one of these. Then I get the breakdown by the individual codes that have been posted. So I can, and then I can expand that further, and I can actually then see the individual transactions where those postings came from. Okay, so the system is summarising at each level. So it's giving me a summary by GL code and then by distribution rule, and giving me a final total. Okay, and then I can see how the breakdown occurs for the individual cost centres. Okay, so in the case of HP, IBM and other, then you can see those totals match here. For my product line distribution, remember, which was what we wanted to split across the electricity across the different ones in the different factors, then you can see that my 500 has been split by IBM 350, HP 100, and other 50. So that's my 70, 20, 10. Okay, so that's the distribution report. Okay, The second report is the budget versus cost accounting report. And again, if I can select a budget scenario here. For those of you who were sitting in on the last webinar we did, which was about budgeting, you'd be familiar with the fact that it's possible to define multiple budget scenarios. So I can select any of those budget scenarios to run with this particular report. So I'll just pick my main budget for now. I'm just going to do it against my P&L accounts to start with, and I'm going to run it here against region first. Okay. So again, when I run it, I get a breakdown of the different codes that I've linked in here, and you can see totals there for Europe, rest of the world, and UK and Ireland, and I can also collapse that view as well and just get summaries across all of those different values. So these figures on the left hand side are coming from my budget setup, so my budget scenario, and then my overall actuals and differences, and then on the right hand side I can see the different values coming from the cost accounting, and again there are some differences here between the actuals that are posted on the left hand side and the actuals posted on the right hand side, because there are obviously transactions in the system before I set up the use of the distribution rules within the system. Okay, so again I can expand out and see the different summaries of those different values here. Okay. Okay, so that's the budget versus cost accounting report. Now the second two reports are those where I can use my hierarchies. So remember we set up a hierarchy for the product line. So if I go down to my cost center report and select product group and indicate that I want to use my template, my product line template, and this time I'm going to run the linked accounts view of my cost center report. And again, for those of you who do use cost centers currently, you'll see that this is very similar in terms of the selection criteria, obviously with the new addition of the dimension and the ability to define this hierarchy template. Okay, so when I open up my report, you can see at the moment product line was just a text line. So if I expand that down, I can now see totals against my printers and my other, and then my final total. And again, I can further expand out printers to see the IBM and the HP and the other. And if you remember what we said earlier when we were setting up the distribution rule for the product line split, and I raised my invoice for my electricity, you can see that the values associated with that particular distribution rule have been logged under the indirect allocation column, whereas everything that's come through from the individual sales transactions where I quoted the distribution rule directly are in the direct allocation column. Okay, but if you remember, if we wanted to, we could also have said that we wanted the distribution rule values to appear in the direct allocation column. Okay, so you have the option to do that. But in this case, my £500 electricity has been split and shown in the indirect allocation column. So I just expand out some of these other lines. Again, you can see my costs here and then my revenue. And again, if I go back and run it for region, I didn't have a template for my region, so again, it will just show the information as per the, I guess, the current way of seeing the information. So again, I can expand out the individual sales and costs against each of my individual cost centres. Excuse me. Okay, and then the final report that I'm going to show you this morning is the new cost accounting summary report. And again, I have the ability to run that by either by the just a normal view for a particular dimension, and then I can run it for selected cost centres, or alternatively, this is where I can use my hierarchy template. Just going back to the cost centre option, this is a useful one where, as in quite a lot of the reports that use cost centres as an alternative selection criteria, you have the ability usually to define a range of cost centres, which means that you have to be quite careful about how you define your individual cost centres, so that if you want to group them together in particular reports, it's easy to do so because they can all be selected in a range. However, in this one you can individually tick on and off a particular cost centre. So, for instance, I could have Europe and UK and Ireland and miss out rest of world, whereas if I was having to select a range I wouldn't be able to do that. Okay, but in this case I'm just going to select all of them. I'm going to use my hierarchy template, my product group, and okay, so again I can run that as a collapsed or expanded view and expand it level by level. So again I can see my totals by the individual groupings, and then furthermore drill down through the individual accounts and down to the individual transactions. So again, if I just look down to my electricity one, I can see that that was where I used the distribution rule as opposed to the individual cost centre. Okay, so again, the other facility that's been added into most of the cost centre reports today is the ability to drill back from either the distribution rule or the cost centre field. Okay, whereas in the current reports you don't have the ability to drill back. Okay, so that's all I was planning to show you today. We do have a short time available now if anyone would like to ask a question.
Thanks, Dawn, for an excellent presentation. I think you'll all agree. So if, as Dawn said, anybody's got any questions, you can raise your hand and we can unmute you and you can ask the question directly, or you can simply type it into the chat or the message box there at the bottom of your panel. Okay, a question in here from Martin. Just one second, Martin. Now we're all able to hear you, Martin.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, fantastic.
Yes, I can hear you fine, Martin.
Yeah, thanks very much for that, Dawn. That was a very good delivery. It's certainly very complex. In your dimensions, where product grouping, we've linked our product groups by item group, which is GL by item group. So
okay.
What's the difference between using item groups at the GL level and the dimension?
Well, to be honest, if you're already using item group, it doesn't, it doesn't give you anything extra. The only way it might give you something extra was if you wanted to use the distribution rule for indirect allocation of costs across multiple cost centres.
Okay.
So, yeah, I mean, okay, I've picked product group this morning and region because they're quite common, and again, not everybody uses product group to split their GL codes, because obviously the other main option you have for doing that is by warehouse. So I think in the past, people who chose to do their GL account determination by warehouse then had the problem of how they were going to report on, you know, a sort of product or item grouping. This gives you the ability to do those. So, you know, you may want to turn it around and use it for warehouses, for example, you know, if you run with multiple warehouses.
That's right. If there's a second dimension, for instance, and I've used product group as the item group, it would probably not make sense to use product group as a dimension. But for instance, I could then use region as a dimension against the item group, and I could report it that way, couldn't I?
Yes, I mean, I guess commonly people, again, who are using a single account code rather than a segmented account code often want to define a department, maybe for recording costs. And again, in the past, it meant if you wanted to use the cost centre for different values, you ended up with a bit of a mishmash. Whereas now you can clearly separate them out. So, you know, you could keep region in one and then use your, say, departments or divisions in another one, for example, say if you're running different branches or, you know, departments like, you know, sales and administration and that type of thing. So. Okay,
excellent. Lastly then, if I'm going to start installing more spray booths, which are bigger projects, would you recommend that I use cost centres to bring all the costs and the revenue together, or use the project codes for, say, you know, let's say I did a dozen projects a year of separately identifiable by either a customer or the type of product that we're selling? Would you use cost centres or would you use project codes?
Well, I think traditionally a project code is seen as having a finite life. Obviously now you have the ability to put effective from and to dates and inactive flags against cost centres. Then they start to blur a little bit. Obviously the only thing you don't have with the projects is the ability to do the distribution rule allocation, you know, to a project, if you like. So you would have to, but you can use projects in conjunction with your cost centres. So they're not, you know, you can use, you know, you can actually use both. So I'm going to say, generally I would say most people would see the project as being you know, a sort of having a real beginning and end rather than an ongoing sort of collection basis. But you can actually use both. Although I didn't obviously show you the use of projects this morning, if I just go back to my sales document, for example, and you know, so the project code here. The project code here is in addition to your cost centres, so it actually gives you another alternative way of looking at of analysing your costs.
It could be a sub analysis code, Martin. If you were doing a rollout of 20, you could create a cost centre for that rollout, and then each individual one could be a project as well.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Martin. So it doesn't appear like we've any more questions this morning. So with that, we'll conclude today's presentation. Thank you all for taking the time. And again, if any more questions come along between now and whenever, please drop us a line and we'd be delighted to